Hey everyone, it's great to see you. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about transdiagnostic issues. And what that means is that's any concept or phenomena which cuts across disorders, and so it's relevant to many different kinds of mental health problems. There are many different kinds of transdiagnostic issues, but there are three in particular we'll be talking about today. Those are personality, internalizing and externalizing problems, and lastly, identity. So we'll go through those three transdiagnostic issues in a little bit of detail. I'll give some examples of each, and then we'll tie it all together, and that'll be today's video. The first transdiagnostic issue we'll be talking about is personality. Now, it's not hard to imagine that one's personality is relevant to one's mental health, and there are many different ways of studying personality, but one particular model that's been really helpful for researchers is what's called the Big Five model. You can read a lot about that from researchers Costa and McRae. And what this consists of is 5 factors that have been validated through years of research that seem to do a decent job of explaining human personality. Those are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. If it helps you to remember it, think of the acronym OCEAN. Okay, OCEAN, or other people will spell it differently and say canoe. But in either case, the studies seem to show that these 5 concepts do a decent job of explaining variations in human thought, feeling, and behavior over time. So personality. That's relevant to mental health for a number of reasons. For instance, folks with higher levels of neuroticism are generally going to be at a higher risk of all sorts of different personality, mood, and anxiety disorders. Before I get ahead of myself, why don't we define each of these things? Now, some of you may have heard of these before, but let's just make them clear. So openness, or in other words, openness to experience, has to do with one's level of willingness to entertain new thoughts and willingness to engage in new behaviors. So folks that are higher on openness would be the type of people that would try new food, try new sports, go skydiving, or would be willing to consider new ways of thinking. So they might read about a religion that's not familiar to them, or they might read about a political system that they're not used to and think, oh, that's worth thinking about. So that's more highly open. Folks that are more closed, or on the opposite end of that spectrum, would be those that are more comfortable with routine, tradition, and see value in keeping things the same. Importantly, with all 5 of these, they are spectrums, and there's nothing bad per se about being on either end, right? So they are just neutral descriptions of personality. We don't really get to risky or unhealthy behavior until we get to the very extreme in either direction, right? So if we envision a really extremely highly open-minded person, they might be prone to boredom and end up taking risks. If we envision someone who is really extremely low on openness, well, they're never willing to try anything different, and others might find them boring and rigid, right? Okay, another important one, conscientiousness. Now first what I want to do is clarify what conscientiousness is not, because this is often confused. Conscientiousness is not consciousness. So consciousness, or to be conscious, is to be aware, to be awake, to be alert, right? So somebody who is in a coma is not conscious. Somebody who is sleeping is less conscious than someone who is awake. That has nothing to do with this. Conscientiousness is also not having a conscience. Having a conscience is like having a moral compass, trying to do the right thing, trying to do what is noble, trying to do what is best. Okay, try to just erase that stuff from your head while you think about this term. This term has to do with order, routine, reliability, organization, and being dutiful. So the thing that helps me remember it is that a conscientious student knows how to spell conscientiousness, because conscientious folks often make really good students because they're organized, they're punctual, they know exactly when and where and how to get everything done. Another great indicator, a conscientious person updates their planner really regularly. A less conscientious person might be a little more prone to flexibility, spontaneity, being less planned, being less organized. Okay, again, the vast majority of that spectrum is not bad per se, but extremes in either direction can be problematic and can be related to mental health. So for instance, folks that are extremely highly conscientious are sometimes more at risk to develop OCD. Okay, third here, extroversion. I imagine many of you have heard of this. It's a pretty everyday term. It's on a spectrum from being extroverted to introverted, and that has to do with one's outgoingness. So more extroverted folks are comfortable taking leadership positions. They're more comfortable being in charge, talking a lot. They tend to make decisions out loud rather than thinking it through in their heads. And they tend to feel more rejuvenated by spending time with people. Introverts are the opposite. They tend to feel more rejuvenated spending time in alone activities like reading, music. They would prefer to think through things on their own. They would be more comfortable in work settings where they get a lot done on their own pace rather than having to do group work or rather than being a leader. Agreeableness is kind of self-explanatory. It has to do with literally how agreeable one is. So, are you likely to agree when others give their ideas? Are you likely to go along with what other people say? Some other pieces and parts of that include being trusting of others and also being honest. So again, it's not necessarily bad to be less agreeable. That may be important if your job involves debating or dealing with conflict. A really agreeable person may not make a great lawyer, for instance. When we think about this in terms of mental health, highly agreeable folks are sometimes more at risk for dependency, and that can cause problems in relationships, and it can be a part of a personality disorder. Lastly is neuroticism, and so this has to do with the tendency to feel negative emotions and to be emotionally unstable. Now again, you might be thinking that inherently has a negative to it, right? Well, kind of. Slightly neurotic people tend to be more empathic of others because they understand what the whole range of emotions feels like. Less neurotic folks can sometimes be a bit cold or unempathic. But for the most part, the whole range is, again, it's just a descriptor for people. When we get to the extremes, now we're talking something that could be problematic. So folks that are extremely low on neuroticism may engage in antisocial behaviors. They may act out against others and not feel remorse. Folks that are extremely high on neuroticism, like I mentioned earlier, are going to be at risk for a whole host of different disorders, from mood problems, anxiety problems, body image problems, personality problems, more susceptible to using substances, all because these folks tend to feel feelings in a bigger, less stable, and more negative kind of a way. Okay, so personality is one of the relevant transdiagnostic issues. Now, a second transdiagnostic issue I'd like to talk about is the idea of internalizing and externalizing. These are both ways of coping with one's life or sort of working through the suffering that someone is experiencing. They can be positive, but for the most part, when we talk about someone being an internalizer or being an externalizer, we're referring to that in a symptomatic or unhealthy kind of way. So let me explain a little bit more. Internalizing would be to experience one's suffering primarily within the confines of their own mind. So examples of this could include things like rumination. So I keep thinking the same problem over and over and over and over. And this is typical for very anxious folks. It's also typical for very depressed folks, right? Thinking about what if, or sort of pondering how badly I did at something. Others could include blaming myself, feeling guilty, or just simply having long-standing negative emotions. These are all sort of inside my mind, so we could call these internal or internalizing patterns of behavior and symptom. Now, externalizing is sort of the opposite. So it has to do with using stimuli outside of my mind to cope with what's in my mind. So these would be things like stress eating, or drinking to try and numb one's pain, using drugs, substances of any kind to make a mental experience go away. Externalizing would also include acting out behaviors. So I'm really frustrated about something, so I punch a brick wall, right? I'm literally taking a problem that's in my mind and externalizing it onto some physical act of aggression or an outburst outside of myself. Now, what's interesting about this and why it's relevant to mental health, of course, is that these are patterns in ways people deal with their lives. And research by Kruger and Markin has shown that you can map these ideas onto many of the disorders that we're talking about. So for instance, major depressive disorder tends to be largely an internalizing problem, as does generalized anxiety disorder. Some other issues like conduct disorder or substance dependence are more associated with this idea of externalizing, which makes sense. Then, interestingly, there are some disorder patterns that seem to be a blend of both, like OCD. OCD is a perfect example because the obsessions that are a part of OCD are strictly internalizing, right? I keep thinking about the same issue, whether it's a fear of germs and contamination or a fear of having accidentally offended someone. And then the compulsion is an external behavior. So it's me doing something physically in the real world to check or assure that my obsession is in check. So if I have an obsession about germs, I wash my hands compulsively. If I have an obsession about having offended people, I might compulsively apologize and pray about it. Okay? The other interesting thing is that people's tendencies to be internalizers and externalizers, it's actually correlated. So I don't want to lead you to think that these are two completely separate ways of being. They're not typologies per se, but these are patterns that people can exhibit that are relevant for understanding mental health problems. The third transdiagnostic issue that I'd like you to be thinking about is identity. What do I mean by identity? Well, that refers to a wide variety of the demographic or qualitative ways in which people identify or define themselves. Things such as what's listed here. So age, SES, or in other words, social class, race, ethnicity, one's culture of origin, their sex, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, gender expression, varying levels of ability or disability with different parts of human functioning, religion, spirituality, other kinds of beliefs, and other parts of identity. These are all inherently very relevant to mental health, regardless of what kind of disorder we might be talking about. These various characteristics of our patients are enormously impactful for how they live and how they handle their own mental health. Just to give a couple of examples, imagine, for instance, how social anxiety may look a bit different in an elderly person than in an adolescent. Consider, for instance, the research that shows that the ways people manifest depression tend to differ by gender, where men tend to experience depression as a bit more of an irritability, frustration sort of style of thinking. Women tend to experience depression with more of what you might think of as the stereotypical depressive episodes that are feeling down, having crying spells, or the guilt parts of depression, with overlap in both directions, of course. Consider also that religious minorities and people of color in the United States are at a higher risk for hate crimes. Hate crimes can often be very personally intrusive and traumatic. So now we have a stimulus that could be relevant for post-traumatic symptomatology, right? So all of these things are really inherently wound up into who a person is, how they live their life, and how they handle their own mental health. So it's really important that we consider these things, and that we don't just look at people as checkboxes or lists of symptoms that exist kind of outside the realm of the person that they live within. Another important thing to keep in mind is that all of these different identity characteristics are intersectional with one another and have varying levels of power or oppression associated with them. So there are important differences between being a straight woman of color being a lesbian woman of color, right? When it comes to how society treats you, how others view you, the kinds of rights and access that you have on a day-to-day basis. And that's just to take two variables and make kind of a two-by-two interaction, right? Think of all the different things that make up identity and how they all interrelate and intersect and can all be part of this complex web of ways in which certain people are given less access in society, or given less respect, given less of a fair shot, right? Which is also extremely relevant to their mental health. If you're fascinated about that intersectionality idea, do some reading from Bell Hooks. She's a prolific writer who's explored the ideas of intersecting race, social class, and gender. Really phenomenal author. So keep all these things in mind when we think about one's mental health, right? Again, regardless of what kind of disorder we might be thinking of, identity is a piece to explore. So the take-home message here is that when we think about mental health, diagnostics is not the whole picture. Your patient is not completely explained by the one or two or more sets of DSM criteria which they seem to fit into. Instead, I want you to be thinking about transdiagnostic issues, things that cut across various kinds of mental health. Ideas such as personality, internalizing and externalizing patterns, and identity, and many more. The fact is, it's complicated. I want you to stay curious about the people you're working with. Whether or not you end up working in clinical psychology or applied psychology of some kind, maybe you'll go into chiropractic, maybe you'll go into medicine or physical therapy or some other completely unrelated thing, HR, management, sales, who knows. When you're interacting with other people, stay curious about them. Try not to put them into boxes, try not to do shortcuts and labels, but think of them as having many complicated interrelated parts that are all relevant to the person they are and are all relevant to their mental health. I hope that makes sense. It's complicated. Stay curious about it. So thanks for watching. That's the general idea. Have a wonderful day.